Welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the podcast, host Craig Jeffery talks with Marie-Charlotte, head of KYC Compliance Services at Swift, on Know Your Customer Solutions. Topics of discussion center around the history of Swift, KYC principles, and the adoption and experience of banks and corporate treasury groups. Listen in to the discussion to find out more.
Welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast. This is Craig Jeffery, your host for today's episode. I am joined by Marie-Charlotte, who is the head of KYC Compliance Services at Swift. She has global responsibility for KYC, and she's located in Belgium. Welcome to the podcast, Marie.
Thank you, Greg. Nice meeting you, and thank you for having me.
So, Marie, maybe you could start by giving us a background of your history at Swift. It's an interesting story, your career there. What have you done, and what's brought you to this particular role?
Happy to cover a bit the history here. So, my name is Marie-Charlotte. I'm in charge of the KYC Compliance Services at Swift. As you mentioned it, I'm at Swift for 11 years. I started in the operational team, where I started to learn about really the background and all the operational aspect of Swift, which was a very, very good school. I moved then to the marketing department, where I started working on corporate and what is the value proposition for a corporate to join Swift. And then 5 years ago, I moved onto the compliance space, in particular KYC, to basically start working on a brand new project, the KYC registry. So I've been on this topic for 5 years now. So I know that KYC is really seen as a pain today, but I would say for me it's quite the opposite, because it's a topic which is really close to my heart. I'm working on that for 5 years, and I'm still not done with it. I'm still passionate about it. And of course, I see it from the other side, as obviously our role at Swift is to offer a solution to help banks and other institutions fighting against financial crime. So yeah, the background, on one side on the corporate and building the value proposition for corporate, and then my history within the compliance department makes it a very nice context to continue shaping our KYC offering today.
If you could also explain a little bit of the background of compliance at Swift. What's been going on at Swift with compliance over time? I know you have some products and things that are available now, but just give us a background on that.
Sure. So compliance has been on top of the agenda at Swift for a number of years already, and it still is. So basically, if we look at a bit the context, after the financial crisis, or the community started to face really huge financial crime compliance challenges. And when I talk about challenges, I'm talking about the regulatory pressure, which is increasing around sanctions, around AML, the cost pressure as well, when you see how many billions are spent on compliance with no real definition of success at the end for institution, and as well the need for an increased transparency, which is coming from the regulators and the industry. So at that moment, and basically on request of our community, we started to look into the compliance area. We started to develop a compliance service portfolio, and it was basically based on 3 key principles. So one was we should focus on what we know, which is for Swift payment and correspondent banks. We should start small and then scale up. But first, start small. And then at the end, we should offer something which is of value for the different customer segments. So we started with our compliance offering in 2012 with sanction screening services at the time. And then 2 years later, we expanded our portfolio to KYC and as well as data analytics. KYC was one of the major challenges raised by the community, and we were really keen to look into solving and addressing this challenge.
Before we jump more into the challenges, because I do want to hear more about the challenges that banks face and then what corporates face, but you had mentioned the 3 areas of sanction screening, KYC, and data analytics. Can you give us a little bit more of a description of each of those?
As part of the offering, indeed, so we have a product which is called Sanction Screening, which helps institutions to screen their transaction today on the SWIFT network. That's one. Another one is about sanctions testing, which helps institutions testing the effectiveness and the efficiency of their filters. So that's two. And then we also have some more data analytics. So thanks to our unique place, I would say, as a provider of financial services and the network that we have, and basically the messaging, we are able to extract from that some very key insights on what's happening on the network. With all the insights that we have, we believe we are in a strong position to offer to our client as well those real insights when it comes to a relationship with their correspondent, when it comes to high-risk countries, sanctioned countries, and give insight on how their institution is doing against peers and so on. That's about leveraging the data that we have as part of our SWIFT network to give insight to our clients when it comes to sanctions and compliance.
You talked about some of the principles and what matters, but maybe you could go into a little bit more about the challenges that banks are facing. Obviously, sanctions are a big deal. They need to be using the most robust methods of screening for sanctioned items. They need to make sure that when they're onboarding clients or working with partners, these things are done well and efficiently. What are the top challenges that banks see that you help address?
So that's a very good question. And so indeed, challenges on the bank side and then obviously challenges on the corporate side as well. So let me start with the banks. What we see today is that banks need to deal with data which is held in different places. It's often incomplete, it's stale. They need to continuously reach out to their corporate clients to get additional information. So in the context of KYC, where you need to know who is your client, this is a really cumbersome process because you keep on going back to your client asking additional stuff. And as a client, you receive those requests from multiple correspondents. So for a bank who needs to perform the KYC, it's really about the access to the data. So as I mentioned, it makes the process really cumbersome because you need to look up for different sources. You don't always find the information of good quality. It's obviously time-consuming, and what we hear is that it has a tremendous impact on the relationship in a negative way. We hear that from corporate and also from correspondent banks, that the KYC process is really cumbersome because they keep on receiving requests from their banks. So that's a real challenge today. On the corporate front, the challenge is also there because as a corporate, you need to provide your information to multiple banks if you are a multi-bank corporate. It's really heavy workload. It's cited, I think, as one of the top 3 challenges by corporate treasurers today. So providing the same information several times in multiple formats to their banking partners. So not only at the onboarding time when you want to start a relationship, but also for the KYC reviews because it's an ongoing process. So overall, whether it's for banks or for corporates, it's a process which is cumbersome, time-consuming, costly, and that has a negative impact on the relationship overall.
Yeah, now it definitely is cumbersome both for banks and for corporates, especially in the area when you're just focused on compliance. But some banks ask for and require different information for KYC. It's not exactly lockstep what everyone's asking for. Is that another common issue that you're seeing in this, that banks are asking for different sets of data to support their KYC requirements?
Yeah, definitely, because every bank is basically taking the regulation in every country and digesting those regulations their own way. So that's why the KYC questionnaires of banks today have different flavors, even if at the end it's to ask the same type of questions. And so that's why it's all about standardization. And so that's one of the key principles of our offering. Standardization is really looking at, okay, what are the common set of information which are requested today across the community? Can we find a common ground? First question. And obviously the answer is yes. And then what are the differences between countries that are also highlighted there? So standardization is really one of the key principles because it helps streamlining the overall KYC process. The information is standardized, it's agreed across the financial community, and it helps institutions provide that information in a more easy way.
Maybe you could tell us, what's the experience on the SWIFT network with KYC activity? What's the take-up or adoption levels? And I know you started with banks first, and it's being extended to corporates, but why don't you tell us what you're seeing from a numbers perspective with banks?
Yeah, sure. So we started with banks indeed. So in 2014, we went live with the first version of the registry. And the reason why we started with correspondent banking is because it was what the community considered as a priority at the time. So rapidly after, we extended the solution to banks who are not on SWIFT as well, to simply enable them to benefit from the same solution. Because at the end, it doesn't really matter whether or not you are connected to the SWIFT network. You have to comply with KYC. We were then requested to look at extending the scope to the corporate segment. And as I mentioned earlier, one of our principles is to focus. So I mentioned that when we were talking about the background on compliance and our FCC portfolio, focus is the key. We have been focusing on FI, and today, to share where we stand in terms of adoption, we count more than 5,500 banks registered and using the service. So we also wanted to demonstrate that the utility model was working, which is what we have done today. So with the great adoption that we have today, we can call it a success, and we are really building on that success now to extend the scope to the corporate segment. That's one of the key drivers. It's the success with the correspondent banking offering, which puts us in a good position to extend now the scope as well, because we are somehow trusted to do so.
So the 5,500, that's about half of the banks that are on SWIFT, right?
It's actually a bigger proportion than that.
Okay.
So on SWIFT today, we have roughly 8,000 banks registered. So we are more than halfway in terms of adoption when it comes to banks. Of course, we have other users of the SWIFT network. We have corporate, we have non-bank financial institutions. But when it comes to correspondent banks and financial institutions, we are at 70% of adoption rate, I would say.
Yeah, about 70% of the banks on SWIFT, plus you extended it to banks that aren't on the SWIFT network. And then now it's being extended to corporates. Maybe you can discuss what brought you there to bring corporates into it, how you leveraged banks and corporates, or what you refer to as the community, to extend this type of offering.
As I mentioned, the reason why we are extending now to corporate is first because it was a request from our community. And not during the last months, but a couple of years ago already, where the message was really that we wanted to succeed with banks first. So we are now happy to extend the registry to the corporate segment. So we will go live later this year. So it has been a journey. And at the same time, the opening is coming quite rapidly. So since the beginning of the year, actually, we've been working with the community to shape the offering. The decision to extend the registry to corporate was approved by our board end of last year. So in January this year, we built what we call a working group, which is composed today of 15 banks and 19 corporates across the world. And this is really the way we work at SWIFT. We put the community together to discuss basically how the solution should look like. We have defined a standard for banks. Now we are defining a standard for corporate. So this has been a clear role from the working group as well to help us building this standard. The group is helping us validating the features and looking at new features that we need to bring on the platform as well. And as well supporting us towards the launch. So when it comes to market engagement activities, so clearly those 15 banks and 19 corporates, they are our ambassadors, if I can call it like this. And so we also count on them to show to the community what we have been doing, how the solution works, what are the benefits, what are the expectations from corporate, from banks, and really create that dynamic within the community that will help the solution being a success. Because if obviously for utility to work, if it's not being adopted by the community, it's not going to fly. The support from the community there is really key. It's really the spirit of SWIFT, and it's really powerful.
So 34 organizations are participating in this. How will this matter to me as a corporate treasurer? Is it about onboarding? Is it about staying compliant with KYC? What's the value to me as a corporate?
So as a corporate treasurer, If you look at KYC, clearly it's a challenge. I've not met any treasurer who mentioned that KYC is not a burden today. It's about the repetitive sharing of information, if we want to summarize it. So why it matters for corporates is because they want to have an efficient process. They want to stop sharing information on a bilateral basis. If the corporate is multi-banked, obviously, because it's not going to impact corporates who just have one or two banks, because then, of course, the bilateral exchange is much more reduced. So it's only impacting multi-banked corporates who need to share this information at the same time in different format and so on. Basically, with the registry, what we offer them is one-stop shop to upload, to maintain their KYC information in a standardized way and in one central place. So it helps reduce the time that it took before through bilateral exchange. It helps streamlining the overall process. It improves the relationship at the end as well, because as I mentioned, those repetitive exchange of information were negatively impacting the relationship. Overall, reducing the cost as well, because the time spent on exchanging this information also has a cost. Reduction of cost, reduction of the burden which is associated to it for a more efficient process. I think many initiatives are driven by the customer experience today. It's a key recurring theme nowadays. The KYC registry is a good example where we put the client at the center and where we want to provide a full customer experience.
If I'm a corporate, I upload all my information into the Swift repository of this information, and then it's not available to everybody. I make it available to, let's say, my 10 banks. I don't have to share with each bank individually. I just can allow them and grant them permission to see that. Is that how you would describe it working in simple terms?
Yeah, exactly. So the principle is that it's user-controlled and user-owned. So by user-controlled, we mean that as a corporate or as a bank, when you provide your information to the registry, you keep control on who can access your data. So you maintain the full ownership and the control over who access your information. And user-owned because the information that you provide on the registry is also into your full ownership. You basically keep control on what is the data which is available on the registry and who can view your data. And it's really, really important to basically know where your data is today.
Yeah, so if I add that 11th bank and I need to share information, I just authorize them to see that. It's just letting them check the records, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And the way it works, to make it very concrete, so when a bank is looking for information of a correspondent on the platform, the bank will initiate what we call a request to the correspondent, who will then be able to approve the request. So that there is a communication mechanism embedded through the platform, which allows one institution to speak with another, and the information is released through an approval, which is granted by the owner of the information.
Is that a similar type of process to RMA where there's the relationship management agreement is shared, or is this a different technology solution within the Swift platform or web?
So I would say the latter, where RMA is actually, so indeed a relationship management application, it's an agreement between two institutions to start doing business. The registry is more a mean to start exchanging information. So it's really a platform that we offer to the community to start exchanging information. Of course, there is this granting mechanism, which indeed could sound like it's an RMA, but the RMA is way outside of the platform and is basically a prerequisite before doing any type of business between two correspondents.
Another question I have is, why is Swift different in this space of KYC versus other solutions here? And then I'll say the second question, which is really related to it, is this utility model viable, where Swift provides a utility, not just a network, like I have a network to connect to others easily, but now I have a utility. How do you see this in terms of viability?
I would start with your first question about why we believe we are different. First of all, our cooperative nature makes us a trusted partner, clearly. So the fact that we work on initiatives for and together with the financial community, it has been and it still today is a strong leverage to our success. And then secondly, we have a well-established utility today. So I mentioned earlier with 5,500 banks registered today, it's somehow proving that the utility model is working. So to answer your second question now, so yes, it's working, and that's the reason why we are quite confident that we can extend it to the corporate segment today.
Yeah. What's the power of a network? It's the size of the network, and it's what you can do on the network. So those are. What other developments are happening in the KYC space that people would want to know about or should know about?
So yeah, obviously corporate is one of the main development we are looking at now. Now in terms of technology, another one which we have been focusing on and that we still plan on improving during the next years is the API. So API is basically a technology that will help our users automate the way they interact with the KYC registry. So the objective is obviously to create efficiency times, particularly for large institutions. So concretely, how does it work? It enables banks who consume the information from the platform to automate and to integrate the data directly in their back office system. Customers, they can use the API to automatically schedule the download of a correspondent bank KYC profile, and the data is stored directly in their internal database. So instead of downloading information manually, it's done automatically. And so, of course, it eliminates the manual effort and the overall efficiency when it comes to collecting KYC information. So a very interesting proof point to share is that for some of our clients, for example, the data collection time has been reduced to 30 minutes, where previously it was taking sometimes days and months to get all the information collected, including the reach out to the client directly. So the data collection time is reduced, and it really helps clients focusing on the actual risk assessment, which is really the key. So when it comes to improving the technology API, so if today banks are able to reduce the collection time to 30 minutes by accessing the registry, the API and the fact that the download of information is automated will even more reduce that time.
That certainly takes the headaches away from the banks, and I think by an indirect nature helps the corporates as well. If you're putting your stuff in there, the banks that set up and connect digitally by API have a more streamlined approach. That sounds excellent. How many banks are using the APIs that you've exposed the system to?
So we just launched it earlier this year. So we have a number of banks who are still testing the technology. A number of them have signed up already. So yeah, at this stage, I would say a number of our large banks are really exploring and testing the API.
I'm sure at some point when we do another podcast, I'd love to hear how that goes and how quickly that's adopted. That seems like a very efficient way of streamlining the challenging process of KYC.
Yeah, sure. It will be my pleasure to give you more information about that, sure. And as well as after the launch of the corporate offering. I'm so happy to come back and share some insight on how the take-up is going.
Before we close the podcast, Marie-Charlotte, I wanted to see if you had any final thoughts or things to share with our audience about KYC and what Swift's doing there.
I would say one of the things that makes a utility successful today is, first of all, its adoption. If a utility is not being adopted, it's not going to work. And then it's all about standardization as well. So the work that we have been doing with the community to look at standardizing KYC requirements has been well accepted by the community, and we see today that our standard is being accepted by more than 5,000 banks, which is really great. And at the end, our solution is there to improve the efficiencies in the KYC processes of banks and corporates. So customer experience is really a key driver there.
Very good. Marie-Charlotte, thank you very much for your time today on the Treasury Update Podcast.
Thank you, Greg.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update Podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.